for blessing. But I'm also so grateful to their children who have grown this event in loving memory of their parents, Nick and Michelle Keller, Jim and Lee Keller, Barbara and Stuart Sulman, and now their children, and one day, God willing, their grandchildren will be supporting this as well. So please, let's show our appreciation for the Keller family's wonderful provision of this very special gift. I'm going to do a little bit of a bio, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a setup, and then we'll have at it. Bari Weiss. This is Bari Weiss. It's like a hometown crowd here. All right. Bari Weiss is an opinion writer and editor, the author of How to Fight Anti-Semitism, which won the 2019 National Jewish Book Award and a Natan Notable Book Award in 2021. Bari launched the Common Sense with Bari Weiss Substack, which many of us read religiously, so to speak, and honestly, the podcast with Bari Weiss. From 2017 to 2020, Bari was an opinion writer and editor at the New York Times. I enjoyed reading her there. Before a dramatic and impactful departure. Before that, she was an op-ed and book review editor at the Wall Street Journal and a senior editor at Tablet magazine. Bari has won several awards, including the Daniel Pearl Award for Courage and Integrity in Journalism, and Reason Foundation's 2018 Bastiat Prize, which honors writing that best demonstrates the importance of freedom with originality, wit, and eloquence. In 2019, Vanity Fair called Weiss the Times' star opinion writer, and the Jerusalem Post named Bari the 7th most influential Jew in the world. Wow. Wow.
I'm wondering why it wasn't 6.
That is a freighted title, my goodness, my goodness. And so again, it is a distinct pleasure to welcome and share with you for this Keller lectureship, Bari Weiss. Thank you. And now a little bit of my...
Thanks for the build-up.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's wonderful to have these things. You don't want to just wait and, God forbid, until you're gone to hear the eulogy. It's good. So a little bit of a setup here. Perhaps it was, for many of us here at Temple, the hateful graffiti posted on our temple in March 2017 stating that, quote, "The Holocaust is fake history," a troubling event whose silver lining was the incredible international outpouring of support from literally thousands of people who saw it covered on CNN. Or maybe it was something that you know all too well and was too close to home for you, the horrific synagogue shooting at Tree of Life in 2018, again evoking the presence here when we had a vigil of literally thousands of people packing this sanctuary and another couple thousand on the street to support us. Or maybe it was the toxic response to Israel's defensive war against Gaza last year with many expressions of Jew hatred not even trying to cloak itself in the guise of anti-Zionism. Or perhaps, of course, it was the recent synagogue attack in Texas. Whatever the trigger, there has clearly been a significant rise in anti-Semitic expressions and acts over the last few years. In addition, the timeliness is just painful but apt. The ADL just released a study this morning that marked 2021 as a year with the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents. We Jews know from our history that we are civilization's canary in the coal mine, as rises in anti-Semitism mark a metastasizing of tribal conflict and toxicity more broadly. But this time feels a bit different, and I'm grateful to have you here, Bari, to speak on the current state of anti-Semitism, how we can fight back, and I hope offer some prospects for promise as we move into an uncertain future. But first, because your Jewish identity is so clearly a significant element in your work and your thinking, share with us a little bit about your upbringing in early years, as this is clearly a significant lens through which you look at the world and offer your work.
Sure. Well, it's really lovely to be here with all of you. I grew up in Pittsburgh, as you mentioned before. Is someone here from Pittsburgh? I love this. Yes, go Steelers.
Oh, boy.
Sorry.
Now you lost the crowd. All right.
I'm used to that. So grew up in Pittsburgh. And, you know, as everyone who grows up anywhere can attest, what you know is what you know, and you think of it as completely normal. So what was completely normal for me was growing up the oldest of 4 girls in a deeply, proudly Jewish and Zionist home, in a family that was the result of a politically mixed marriage. My dad, a conservative, my mom, a liberal. My mother withheld sex in 2016 and 2020 to make sure my dad wouldn't vote for Trump. He later wrote a piece about how this was like a modern day Liz Estrada. That's my family. He wrote in my mom and then Steph Curry in the year that 2020. That's my family. The other thing that was completely normal for me, beyond being in a family where political disagreement was something that was healthy and normal and not dangerous, but something to be embraced, was that I grew up in a very, very special Jewish community that only in retrospect did I understand was pretty singular. What do I mean by that? It was a shtetl in a lot of ways. It was very normal for my sisters and I to, we would have Shabbat dinner. I missed a lot of school dances in high school because it was a mandatory Shabbat dinner, which in retrospect was fantastic. And we would be arguing and debating often with guests of 20 or something people late into the night. My dad would show up with an extra 5 people and it would be family holdback. I'm assuming people here know what that means. So we were hungry. And then the next morning we would go to synagogue where my sisters and I were like the youngest Torah readers ever in our conservative synagogue. And then we would go to a Chabad family for lunch, and then we would go play basketball at the JCC, and then maybe we'd do Havdalah later. In other words, it wasn't a community that was divided along political and religious denominational lines in the way I think an increasingly polarized, divided America and divided American Jewish community, that's become normal. So that was the context that I grew up in. It was only later, like I said, that I realized that there was something so precious about that. And I will add to this that I grew up literally in the heart of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
That's Squirrel Hill,
in Squirrel Hill. And, I'm sure we'll get to this, but the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah was Tree of Life, which is, of course, a name that everyone here now knows. So that was the context that I grew up in. And I'll say that, as I made my way into the world, and I think maybe this is important, especially for parents in the room, I really came to see that my Judaism and my love of the Jewish people with all of its complications and my love of the Jewish state with all of its complications was pure. In other words, I didn't have like a chip on my shoulder about these things. And I really, really credit that upbringing to whatever courage I've been able to show in my life about those causes. It's that it's coming from a place of very, very deep love and joyfulness, so much so that when I'm forced to make a choice between being cool or being popular or having a certain kind of reputation or status and choosing my values, the decision has honestly, sometimes is difficult, but usually it's a no-brainer. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that I grew up and the way that those values were taught to me.
Is there one thing specifically, because I know so many of us, particularly as parents, want to be able to use a freighted metaphor now, inoculate our kids to the wider culture in a way in which what helps them to define who they are and what they're willing to stand for is hopefully rooted in their Jewish identity. You had wonderful parents, you had this wonderful kind of idyllic Jewish neighborhood. Was that it, or was there something specific that we could take and utilize?
It's funny because my parents, to be clear, they're not, Jewishly super knowledgeable or erudite or, they grew up being Yom Kippur Jews eating cheeseburgers. That was the kind of Jews they were.
So we all have hope.
Yeah, it was only later in life that, through a Wexner program and all these things, they were exposed to incredible Jewish teachers. And I remember very clearly the first family trip we took to Israel. I was 7 years old. And we went because my parents had, a little bit had gone to Israel, but they wanted to learn Hebrew. And they were in Ulpan all summer. I was thrown into like a summer camp where it was socialist, so everyone brought their sandwich, they threw them all into a garbage bag, and you picked out whatever sandwich you got. So like I would come with Nutella, and I was very excited, but then I would end up with like cucumber and cream cheese. It was horrible. I point that out only to say that it was something that they came to later, and there's a few things, and I'm saying this especially as my wife and I are going to become parents, please God, in September.
B'Shah
She's
Tova.
pregnant, thank
B'Shah
you.
Tova.
Is that it was just a very joyful thing to be Jewish. That's first of all. All of their resources went to us being Jewish. All of them. We didn't really take vacations other than going to Israel and going to Jewish summer camp and going to Jewish day school. So it was very, very clear where their priorities lied. The other thing I will say is that they really inculcated in us the idea that being a Jew was the greatest honor and privilege of our lives. You know, there's the phrase of, that we're a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? That doesn't mean that we're better than other people or that we think of ourselves as regal or royal or something like that. It means that we're born into a certain set of ideas and of ideas that change the world, and that we are born into a people that were once slaves and have managed to survive everything under the sun, and that we're still here, and that is miraculous. And the other thing I will say is that I'm emotional, but I was really raised to believe also that being alive during the Third Jewish Commonwealth, being alive during the Jewish return to our indigenous home in the land of Israel, was an earthly miracle, if not a theological one. And all of those things, I think, combine to make me feel just an incredible amount of gratitude. And so all of the things that followed, whether it was learning about the occupation or being confronted with students on college campus telling me that to be a Zionist was to be a racist, and on and on and on and on. You guys can all fill them in for yourself. I was rooted in such a deep way with such pride that I was able to kind of withstand everything that came after.
Wonderful. Thank you. Obviously, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting was, I guess I perceived it as, and it sounds like for you as well, an inflection point in many ways. Obviously, more so for you than for anybody having grown up there, and for that being your community, and actually literally when you heard the news, as you wrote so eloquently, worrying about who you're going to call and who you're not going to see the next week in shul because they were tragically murdered. You shared kind of this quote from that piece, that really powerful piece you wrote in the aftermath. What happened in my neighborhood might seem like a nightmare or an illness, something to be endured until in time it passes. That's how it seemed to me. But to those who have spent their lives in places like Karachi or Aleppo, the things Pittsburgh Jews take for granted, our freedom from violence and fear, are nothing more than pipe dreams. When your hometown in Western Pennsylvania becomes the scene of mass murder, you know that the distance separating their reality from ours can be made tissue thin. And I guess I want to ask, as the rawness of this moment, the intensity of that moment has mellowed a bit or has set as kind of a new perspective, do you still believe that the American Jewish reliance on freedom from violence and fear is really a tissue-thin distinction from what Jews experience in other parts of the world? You also shared in your book, Anti-Semitism, which will be for sale outside, that we Jews have lost our instinct for danger. And in so many ways, at the same time, and this is a classic Jewish, on the one hand and on the other, we lost our instinct for danger, but you consider yourself among the luckiest Jews in history. How do we reconcile those feelings of true concern and maybe not enough vigilance with a sense that our experience here, with all of its troubles and challenges, is in many ways very unlike that of Jews throughout history?
That's a beautiful question. And I hope this doesn't seem like a cop-out. It's both, right? When we look at the span of Jewish history over thousands of years, there's no question that, and I still believe this, that we remain the luckiest Jews in all of history. Not just in terms of safety and security, not just in terms of success beyond our wildest imagination, but also in terms of other rights that would have been unimaginable. I remember so clearly when I got the job at the New York Times, calling my grandmother, who still reads it, by the way, and still doesn't understand why I left. She was like, you are living, like, I can't even imagine if my mother was alive for her to look at you in the life you're leading. Walking into the New York Times wearing a Magen David. That's incredible. So even in the short span of my family's lifetime in this country, I'm still the luckiest Jew. So that remains true. Then you have to ask yourself, though, why? What makes living in New York or LA or Seattle different from living in Karachi or Aleppo or a million other places on the map where we're lucky not to have been born? It's because of the ideas that are sacred in this country, right? The ideas that are sacred in this country that have made it the most spectacular diaspora experience in all of Jewish history. What are those ideas? Freedom. The idea that every single human being is created equally in the image of God. The idea that people are not constrained to the circumstances of their birth, that they are not held liable for the sins or the merits of their parents, that they can make their own way in the world. The idea that equality of opportunity and not equality of outcome, and this is crucial, and I want to come back to this, is the true measure of justice. The idea of due process and of rejecting mob rule and mob justice, and I'm realizing I'm saying that blocks away from where the opposite happened. Those ideas, which are completely harmonious with Jewish ones because they are Jewish ones. There is a reason the founders of this country, with all of their flaws, called it a New Jerusalem, called themselves the New Israelites. There is a reason that Benjamin Franklin wanted the image on the Great Seal of America to be Moses crossing the Red Sea. There is a reason that Abraham Lincoln called Americans the almost chosen people. Really, that's real. In other words, the reason that what we now call liberalism, broadly defined, not in a partisan way, is so good for Jews is because the Jews gave the world those ideas. And so the extent to which we continue to see those things I just listed and many more as virtues, as miracles in human history to be safeguarded, then yes, the distance between us and Karachi or Aleppo will remain that, a chasm. But when those virtues are turned into threats, when those virtues are under siege, and I believe they are under profound siege in this country right now in ways that a lot of people still don't yet recognize, then no, this country will not continue to be an exceptional one for American Jews. It's really not about, this is the beauty and the challenge of America. It's not about bloodline, right? It's not about ethnicity. It's about a common adherence to those ideas which supersede identity and bloodline. And that's why I feel so passionately about defending those virtues against threats. Because it's not, in the end, just about the security and the safety of Jews. No, it's about the security and the safety of every single one of us. Because those ideas that we once took for granted in this country are not a given. They are like the anomaly. I just saw the movie The Northman last night. Have you guys seen it?
Oh, was it good?
Okay, I don't want to ruin it for anyone here.
I do
if you do
it.
like it, what I'll say is that when you see this movie, which is unbelievably violent to an extent I cannot even capture, it's a reminder of like, oh wow, yeah, most of human history was violent, brutal, raping, pillaging, you name it. And oh my God, I get to walk around this city at night, or a city, wearing a tank top, holding my wife's hand? What kind of miracle is this? That is not something we should take for granted. I don't take it for granted, and I think one of the reasons, though, that we're at this precarious hinge moment is because too many people have. And that's one of the reasons I feel like it's very, very important to articulate them and then to explain who is challenging them. And often who is challenging them in language that is meant to confuse and distort and hoodwink us.
Beautiful. I mean, in so many ways, come on in. In so many ways, you know, the most vibrant civilizations, the most potentially successful ones are those that treat their Jews and their women well and give them opportunities. And I would say those that don't have clear...
And I would add gay people to that.
Absolutely.
You know, do you treat minorities with dignity and respect and equality, or do you not? I mean, there's so many basic litmus tests.
No, absolutely. You've written about what I consider one of the greatest tensions for modern American Jews, and that is, as Jews, our historic and really disproportionate role as a beleaguered minority, willing to risk so much of our status and position, whatever it was, even as tenuous as it was, to defend society's other most vulnerable and oppressed people. And balancing that in tension with our designation by many as a complicit part of the white majority. In the current climate of a Manichaean separation between oppressor and victim, white folks and communities of color, which is not accurate but is popular, Jews are seen by many as beneficiaries of white privilege at best, purveyors of white supremacy most insidiously. Is there a way for American Jews to more effectively push back against the painful irony of how we see ourselves and what we've done versus how others increasingly are seeing us?
Wow. Yes. I'll start by diagnosing what just taking what you said one step further and building on it, and then I'll answer how I think we can do this better, because we're losing. The first is to say that, you know, it's very strange, but in a way it's a deeply historical role that the Jews are in right now in America, because we've been in it many times before. And if anyone in this room feels homeless, or like you have no place to stand, or the place that you stand in the center is sort of rapidly shrinking, and that you're kind of getting squeezed from two sides, that's a very Jewish position. So take a little bit of comfort in the fact that there's nothing new about that. The terms, right, that we're being squeezed in right now are very American ones. So the far right says to us, you're the greatest trick the devil has ever played. You look like you're white, you're successful, you pass, but you're loyal to black people and brown people and Muslims and sexual minorities, and you're deviant. And, you know, the reason that the Pittsburgh neo-Nazis selected Tree of Life, right, was because the previous week it had participated in Refugee Shabbat, honoring the Jewish command to welcome the stranger, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, as we just remembered on Passover. And at the very same time that neo-Nazis are targeting us physically, I used to say the far left, but increasingly it's elite culture more. It's grown really beyond a lunatic fringe, is saying that we are neo-Nazis. Now, how do they do that? They do that because they say, look at you. You know, you guys claim to be a minority, but look how successful you are. Look how privileged you are. Look how much you benefit from a system of white supremacy. You, in a way, uphold it because you're adjacent to it. And unlike us, unlike the real minorities, you're able, if you're Ralph Lifshitz, to change your name to Ralph Lauren, or whatever Jon Stewart's name was before him and Natalie Portman before hers, and we could go on and on. And not only that, not only are you complicit in white supremacy, but you also support the evil state. You also support the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East, which is Israel. So we are made guilty of the two gravest sins in progressive, not just American life, the West. Racism or white supremacy, and colonialism or imperialism. Now, what is the tactic that often Jews, I'll just say progressive Jews, liberal Jews are taking? We're good. Let us into the good group. Let us be the good ally. Look at us. We have people of color in our community too. Look at us. Look how many times we were oppressed. Look at us. We marched, to Selma. Heschel marched with King, and on and on and on and on. In other words, it's a negotiation, okay? It is deeply ineffective, it's undignified, and it doesn't work. So that posture needs to be absolutely abandoned. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ally with other minority communities, not at all. I'm not saying that we shouldn't draw on our rightfully the history that we are deeply proud of in the civil rights movement and use that and talk about it and be incredibly proud of it and put up that picture of King and Heschel in our Hebrew schools. I'm simply saying that trying to play the game of the victimhood Olympics, trying to prove that we shouldn't be just below white cisgendered men on the new hierarchy or caste system of the oppressed, it's a loser's game for us. The right way to fight all of this is by going back to those principles that I was talking about before. It is not to participate in a zero-sum game of identity politics in which people are fighting it out to prove who's the most oppressed. First of all, we're never going to win it. But also, why do we want to win that? Why do we want to win that game? And I'm astonished as I see so many Jews trying to participate in it. Again, though, I will say, just as I said before, that if you feel homeless, it's a deeply Jewish feeling. That kind of negotiation and contortion, and I would say self-erasure, is a deeply, deeply Jewish strategy. And it's tragic and hard to talk about, but I think it's important. There was an example that I came across when I was researching for my book that the rabbi will know because he's much more Jewishly literate than me, but it shocked me to read it. And it was about how in Judea, right, ancient Judea, under the Hellenists, right, think back to the Hanukkah story. The young Jews who wanted to be accepted as proper Hellenists had to play outside in the gymnasium, naked. But there was a problem because they were circumcised. And Gratz, incredible Jewish historian, goes into detail, and it's horrible to describe what these young men would do physically to undo their circumcision. Now, obviously, the terms in America now are very different. No one's asking to see your circumcision, right? Usually not. I don't know enough about Seattle yet, who knows?
Even for Seattle, that might be a bridge too far, okay.
But what they're saying is, prove that you're on the right side of history. Prove that you don't support that bad, bad state that's called Israel. Prove that you don't believe in Jewish power because Jewish power is bad. Prove that you don't believe in Jewish particularism, or you don't believe in the idea of a chosen people, or you don't believe in, and the list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. It's the exact same thing. It's just the terms are different. In the Soviet Union, the demand was no God, no bris, no bar mitzvah, no Torah, no Hebrew. Now what it is no Zionism, no Israeli flag, no. Do you see a pattern? It's the same thing.
Is that the main fissure, though? Is that how we kind of got to this place? Is it really about Israel? And Israel alone is kind of the main point of division?
I think it's two things. I think Israel is the excuse under which anti-Semitism gets smuggled in. I do not think there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism unless you're an anarchist and believe that there should be no states at all. And I'm happy to go into that more. I didn't used to say that as bluntly a decade ago, and now I'm perfectly comfortable saying it. But I think it's a second issue as well. Well, there's two. So it's Israel. It's the way that is a convenient way to smuggle in anti-Semitism. It is that we are living in a moment in which the dominant culture in many of our elite and progressive institutions, like our cultural institutions, our sense-making institutions, our universities, where powerlessness is the virtue and power is the evil. And any group that's associated with power is necessarily bad. And then it's a third thing, which is a vision of anti-racism, which is profoundly anti-humanist, anti-liberal, and anti-American, in which people are either slotted into white, people of color, oppressed, oppressor, victim, victimizer, and oh, what do you know? The Jews are now white people. They're hyper-white people in this view of the world. And so, again, like, the hour is late. And so I'll also say that there is no world in which the ideology that goes by many names, but one of those names is critical race theory, is compatible with a Jewish idea of the world at all. There is not a world in which you suggest that some people are born to a certain status and others are born to another status is compatible with what it means to be a Jew, to be an American, and to be a liberal. And unfortunately, in too many Jewish spaces, there is a feeling that if we just accommodate this ideology, if we just genuflect to it, I know that we're in a shul and I shouldn't use that word, enough.
It's broadly acceptable
Yeah.
in a religious setting, yes.
That it's gonna work out. It's not gonna work out. It has to be rejected. The challenge is that in rejecting it, we're often having to self-deport from places like the New York Times, quite frankly.
Speaking of Israel, one of my favorite of your recent podcasts was with Mati Friedman, who also spoke for this lectureship years ago, in his new book on Leonard Cohen's trip to Israel during the 1973 war. And you had a wonderful conversation with Mati about Cohen's description of Israel as a mythic home for him. That's obviously a freighted statement and has positive and negative connotations. Within Jewish tradition itself, there's a recognition that there's a Yerushalayim Shamala, a Yerushalayim of the heavens, and a Yerushalayim Shamata, a Yerushalayim of the earthy politics.
The one with the
people.
prostitutes and the criminals, speaking
David
Hebrew.
Ben-Gurion, exactly, who talked about it. Can you share a bit more about both the blessings and curses of regarding Israel within mythic dimensions, as Cohen was discussing?
That's such a good question. I think a lot of American Jews grow up with just a mythic Israel. In other words, Jewish Disneyland, right? The idea that it's the light unto the nations. It's going to be, it's the embodiment of all of our values.
The desert
and
blooming.
we project what our values are onto it. It's got to be the paragon of tikkun olam, whatever that word means anymore, right? And then you get there, and yeah, they did make the desert bloom. But also I went to the Kotel right before COVID, and I was there for a feminist, Rosh Chodesh service, and it was hilarious, actually. Maybe you guys will get this. It was right before Purim, and I was spit on. That part was terrible by some ultra-Orthodox teenagers, and then they called me Vashti, which I thought was amazing. I was like, only in Israel am I getting like slut-shamed as Vashti. I thought this was incredible. So what is that experience? On the one hand, it's terrible because this was just a group of women wanting to have their service on the women's side of the Kotel. On the other hand, what other country am I going to get Vashti as an insult? And I sincerely mean that. There's something profound about that. So to me, the solution to the problem of mythic Israel, and Leonard Cohen certainly had his mythic Israel when he set out. By the way, I really recommend this new book. It's called Who by Fire. And I'd love for you guys to listen to my conversation with him. There's tons of Leonard Cohen music and music from the time. Is to encounter the real Israel. Encounter the real Israel and learn to love the real Israel. Because honestly, people hate a place they know nothing about and can't locate it on a map. And they love a place that they really don't know that much about and can barely locate it on a map. And I think the especially for the Jewish community, but for everyone. Like, putting aside Jewish history and why this place would be so important and interesting and significant in the lives of Jews all over the world, it's just an amazingly interesting country. And if you're interested in the Middle East and you're interested in the total shift in power in the Middle East and the way that Israel's done that and the way that it's become, startup nation's a cliche at this point, but really, and how it's done that in so short amount of time, that's pretty incredible. So for me, it's a little bit like a relationship, It's really easy to have a crush on someone. It's way harder to be in a real relationship with a real person.
To that point, aren't we, in some ways, and I'm very sensitive to this as someone who's looking to teach and educate and instill pride in Israel and pride in Jewish identity for the next generation. But I don't know about you, but I grew up with, kind of, as you said, the Ari ben Canaan Exodus version of...
It's still great, by the way.
It is, but if we're only filling our kids with myth and talking points, our young people with myth and talking points, and not engaging in hard conversations about legitimate criticism of Israel, but criticism that comes from a loving intention for it to realize its ideals rather than as a backdoor way to get at an anti-Semitic kind of perspective. Don't we have to get beyond that mythic dimension and really begin to have serious, significant conversations with our young people that encompass criticism, but loving criticism, and criticism that's aspirational?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. It's just a matter of when. In other words, when you're teaching a first grader, a second grader, a third grader about America, you're like, let me teach you about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Founding Fathers, and then the abolitionists and the people who came along to make those promises fulfilled. Let me tell you about all of the magnificent things that make this country exceptional. You're not going to shove Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States into that kid's hand.
I don't know who would want to shove that hand
So
in,
I think it's a matter of time,
Yeah.
right? And I do think I think there's been maybe a self-correct, it depends on the community, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have realized over the past 2 decades that sending young Jews to college campuses where all they know is the Ari ben Canaan version of the story, and all of a sudden they're going to the activities fair the first week of school and people are like, BDS, and that's normal. That's not a good, you're not sending someone off to battle with the right quivers in their, what is that quiver holder called? You get what I mean. What's it called? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know anything about arrows or quivers, but I was going for it.
But it was a good metaphor.
Yeah, thank you. The armature. So that's my point, is that, people need to understand what arguments they're going to encounter. But I also think that no amount of teaching a 16, a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old about to go off to campus, about the West Bank or about Palestinian rights or about the complications at the Syrian border and the way that Israel can't really criticize Russia because it's relying on Russia to make sure it's... No amount of that kind of sophistication is going to matter when that young person is face to face with someone calling them a racist because they believe in the state of Israel's right to exist. What's going to matter to that person, although, by the way, it's great for them to come armed with all of those arguments and all of that level of sophistication, but what's going to matter to that person is, do I love being a Jew? Does being a Jew give me profound meaning and purpose in my life? Because if the answer is no, and if the answer is really, I kind of hated Hebrew school and it's kind of a burden, trust me, that person is either going to join the BDS people, sign the petition they need to sign, or just never think about it again and go on with their lives. Because the stakes, again, of what is being asked of that young person, like, we shouldn't understate it. We're asking them to be called bad names. We're asking them to not get accepted into certain groups of people. We're asking them to be uncool. That's a really, really hard thing when you're 18 and 19 years old. And in my experience, the only kids that are able to withstand it are the kids that have that profoundly deep sense that being a Jew matters to them more than being cool matters to them.
Wonderful. You have been, with two of my other favorite writers, Andrew Sullivan and John McWhorter, a pretty significant critic of extreme wokeness as a threat to civility, democracy, and particularly the Jewish community. In a panel discussion with American Jewish Committee last year, you described it as an ideology that undermines liberalism. And yet in some ways, even though it's gone off in incredibly perverse directions, some of the critical elements of liberalism that provided the foundation for this are familiar to us and things that we want to support, and the inherent dignity of each human being, the obligation not to stand idly by the blood of our neighbor, values of empathy for other people. For me, the red line between my place of classic liberalism and some of the more extreme progressivism is when we go beyond those classic liberal ideals to identitarian politics or what have you. Is it a helpful distinction to say, I can be a classic liberal and still recognize that I need to be aware of what's going on in more extreme progressive circles, and I have to be willing to call it out as much as I expect people on the center right to call out Nazism and white supremacy?
I think I understand it, but it's very sophisticated, so I want to make sure that I do.
Please.
I guess what I would say is that I see wokeness not as an extension of liberalism, but as a rejection of liberalism. Why do I say that? Because, again, these words are very hard, because what do we mean when we say liberalism? What do we mean when we say wokeism? So let me just describe the tenets of it. An ideology that says that the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values are bad because white cisgendered males came up with it is an ideology that is not liberal. An ideology that says we're going to judge the merits of an idea based on the identity of the person expressing it is not a liberal idea. An ideology that says that any inequality of outcome must be a result of systemic racism and discrimination, not a liberal ideology. An ideology that says, I love this example because it just blew my mind. The KIPP charter school's motto was work hard, be nice for like the past 30 years. They got rid of work hard because it was an example of white supremacy culture, working hard. Reason. This is what I'm talking. I'm talking about an ideology that rejects literally the bedrock foundational values of liberalism. What else does this ideology do? Again, forget the name wokeness, I don't care what it's called. An ideology that says that everything in your life needs to be put to a political litmus test. And you can't be friends with or be married to someone that voted in a different way than you. Every single thing in life, friendships, family relationships, marriage, music, art, love, it all needs to be put to the test. And if it doesn't pass, it's bad. That's called totalitarianism. That's not progressivism.
It's kind of Stalinistic. Bret Stephens says this is Soviet propaganda.
It is. These are the features of this new, still emergent ideology that doesn't have a name. And by the way, the reason it doesn't have a name is because it doesn't want to be named.
What did you call it? Therapeutic totalitarianism or something?
Yeah, that's, I think, one good word for it. Someone's called it, and I kind of like this the best. My friend Wesley Yang has called it the successor ideology, as in the successor to liberalism. That's what it's trying to be, trying to overturn liberalism. But it's so unbelievably successful because it hijacks the language of liberalism, and it hijacks the language of progress. It says, this is equity. This is anti-racism. This is social justice. Who wouldn't want to sign up for those things? Those are like the best things in the world. Signed up. But by the way, it turns out that equity in this new ideology isn't actually about equality at all. It's about reinstantiating a new social caste system. And social justice isn't about justice. It's about purging anyone that disagrees with the dogma. And anti-racism isn't really about ending racism. It's about saying, as Ibram Kendi does, that capitalism is racism and that all cultures are the same. Do you guys believe that all cultures are the same? That they're equally good? I don't believe that. I believe that cultures that practice female genital mutilation and force women into burqas are less good than liberal ones. So again, one of the reasons that I think it's worked so well and that it's caught so many good, well-intentioned people flat-footed is because it comes smuggled in language that it's a siren song to liberal ears. Listen to what these people are saying. Do not listen to the slogan. Go read White Fragility tonight.
Ugh.
You will not believe what you see in that book that's being taught, by the way, to your children. Go read How to Be an Anti-Racist and ask yourself, is this going to lead to a more just, better world? Is this going to actually lead to an anti-racist world? I don't believe that that's the case. And so I really think it's incumbent on everyone, especially people that identify as political progressives, to look at what's being done in your name. Look at what's being done in the name of progress. It looks like something very, very different than progress and liberalism to me.
Listen, I also agree with you. It's so easy to slam dunk on Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of the really more extreme folks on the right. And I absolutely agree with you that those of us who are liberal, are the center left, need to be able to call out the extremists on our side of the ledger as much as we expect those leaning more right to do the same thing. However, how do we do that without providing cover for the demagogues who are utilizing things like critical race theory as totems of a culture war, rather than a sophisticated delineation between the need to talk about systematic racism as a part of our country and obsessing over it and seeing it as the singular lens? How do we criticize those on the left, but do so in a way that doesn't give ultimate aid, comfort, and insulation, a kind of moral beard, to those demagogues on the right?
It's really hard. Honestly. Because trust me, the main criticism I get from people on the left, including my friends, is, shut up about this. What you're doing is giving fodder to people who hate you for all kinds of other reasons, because of because of a million reasons. And here's what I say to them. It's my job to tell the truth about the world as I see it. It is very, very morally easy to be a Jew in the world and in America in 2022 and say Nazis are bad and Marjorie Taylor Greene is bad and an idiot and Steve Bannon sucks and I hate the Charlottesville people. It's the easiest thing in the world, guys. That's why everyone can do it. It's why every Jewish community puts out a statement about it. Think about in your community what the reaction has been to the dozens of physical assaults against Haredi Jews on the streets of Brooklyn. Can people in this room name any of those victims? Have there been any hashtag campaigns saying to say their names? Ask yourself why that is. It's very simple. It's because a lot of those attacks have been carried out by people of color, and it's very, very difficult for people to face that uncomfortable reality. When the attacker is a white supremacist, morally clear. What happens when the attacker is an 18-year-old black kid who himself might be the victim of racism in his community? Really morally hard. I try, because I think I have some kind of screw loose, maybe more than other people, to do that on behalf of a lot of other people who don't. So that's the first thing I'll say. I'm trying to shine a light on things that other people do not want to look at because it is ugly and inconvenient. And for whatever reason, I'm more comfortable. I think I'm slightly more disagreeable than a lot of people, and I'm more comfortable doing it. And I think it's very important. I really, really do. I think it's very, very important not to just look at the morally easy cases, but to look at the morally complicated ones. That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is, one of the reasons that I think it's very important to call out the excesses of this ideology is because of the backlash I fear that will come to it. And that's always been my fear. I'm not drawing a comparison between America and Germany, but I want you to think about what came before the war in the 1920s and the decadence and the, people thought it was the most cosmopolitan place in the world. It was unbelievable sexual liberation. It was incredible. But what happened when the pendulum swung in the other direction? There is a reason that Jews thrive in places where there is a healthy political center. I am trying to stand, sometimes alone, in that center by showing that I am willing to call out the excesses on both sides. And yes, often on the left side, because that's where I live. And those are my friends. And those are the people that I sit across from at dinner parties, right? That's largely, I would imagine, this community, right? And so in the same way that, I was just in Western Junction, Colorado the other day. Here's Western Junction. The night before I spoke there, Mike Lindell, my pillow guy, spoke there. It's a town in which literally they're represented by Lauren Boebert, who you might know. She's Marjorie Taylor Greene's BFF. And they're also investigating a local election person. I forget her title, Tina something, because she actually tried to steal the election for Trump. So that's Grand Junction. A school of 10,000, there are 30 Jews there. The kind of illiberalism I'm talking about there is very different than the kind I'm talking about here, right? Because the kind that people in that community are facing who are trying desperately to stay in the land of reason and sanity is that they're hanging out with people who genuinely believe the election was stolen. And the advice that I'm giving a woman whose mother isn't speaking to her because she thinks it wasn't stolen is very different than the kind of advice I'm going to give this group. But I think what's important is trying to give comfort and strength and courage to anyone that's trying to stand up against the extremism in whatever room or community they're standing in. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I think that the backlash to what could come from the insanity that we're in, the insanity that suggests that, there are no difference, biology is not real. It's reached a level that's just so crazy. It's hard. When you describe it, you sound crazy.
Through the looking glass,
yeah,
literally.
That I just fear what the backlash could be. So it's not just that I oppose it on its own merits, it's that I think it's also strategic to oppose it.
Before we hear some curated questions from folks who are here, I just wanted to touch on this. You recently had also a wonderful podcast with Imam Abdullah Antelpi, who's a rare and pluralistic voice of Muslim moderation, intergroup cooperation, and honest confrontation with the eternal dynamics of Muslim anti-Semitism. And I recently recorded a conversation with Muhammad Magid, another very wonderfully forward-looking imam. Are these gentlemen unicorns, or are they the vanguard of a more enlightened American Islam?
Wow. I don't know. I really don't know. I was saying before to you that when I don't know about something, I call up someone way smarter than me that's an expert on the subject. I'd probably call up Imam Abdullah and ask him, because I think if he were sitting up here, he would tell you about the kind of unbelievable vitriol and opposition he's gotten within his own community for doing the kind of work that he does. This is an amazing person you guys should look up. He works with Yossi Klein Halevi, and they do these incredible trips bringing Muslim American leaders to Israel.
Shalom Hartman Institute
Yes.
has put together this incredible leadership
Exactly,
project.
thank you. So I'd honestly have to ask him. The reason that I had him on the podcast is because I want to elevate voices like that. And I want to, and as he would definitely say, he would say, there is no such thing as a Muslim community. There are many, many, many Muslim communities. And I view him as just an unbelievably courageous voice, trying to do the kind of work inside his community that I think a lot of us are trying to do inside of ours, which is standing at the kind of radical center and trying not to give in to not just extremism and polarization, but trying to hold fast to not giving in to like a nihilism, honestly, is what I think is really prevalent right now. that says we're in total war and we just have to fight the other side to the death. I don't want to live in that world. And I really, really want to honor people. And I try as much as I can to do this in my work who are doing that in their own contexts.
Wonderful. Rabbi Spicer, is there, Talia, do you have a couple? Okay, she's working on it. While she's working on it, Rabbi Spicer, if you have a couple, I'll ask one
Now,
more
do you
question.
guys not sending around the microphone because it's like
Well, you know,
Jews and microphones and questions?
Jews and microphones are speeches before questions, and I want to try to get through this as expeditiously as possible. Let me ask you one more question while we're culling a few of these. In that same AJC panel, you also spoke really inspiringly about the need for each of us to willingly offer personal sacrifice as a response to this moment. And particularly in this last week's, or the coming week's Torah portion, where it's all about sacrifice, it's all about the origin of scapegoating, which ironically comes from the Jewish people, but has been thrust against it.
So many thoughts about that, yes.
A relatively a relatively mild sacrifice for all of us to make compared to those who preceded us. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you think is the necessary personal sacrifice we need to make in response to these troubling times?
I can't know the context that each of you is in, personally or professionally or communally or socially. All I can tell you is that I really believe that this moment requires courage and requires bravery and requires coming out of the closet. Not in the sexual way, that's over, which is incredible, generally, especially here in Seattle, but coming out as commonsensical people who reject the kind of ideas that are super chic right now. I think the whole world would be different if that happened. I really do. The number of people that I meet who are living a kind of doublethink, as Natan Sharansky would call it, who have one view in private and one in public, it's a lot of people. And it's really, really strange, given that we're living in the land of the free and the home of the brave and the most liberal society in American history, in all of history. It's pretty weird. You know, I've watched the movie, and I really recommend it, rewatch The Lives of Others. It's eerily relevant. It takes place in East Germany. It's about the Stasi. It's incredible. There's some strange behavior going on right now. And I think the number one thing, as Harvey Milk would say in a totally different context, come out. Come out. Coming out required for gay people in a different time a lot of sacrifice and stigma. It changed the whole world when they did that. So what would it look like for the people who are either hiding their pride in being Jewish, or hiding their Jewish star, or hiding their love of the state of Israel, or hiding the fact that maybe they think sometimes Republicans have a good point? The whole world might be different. And that's just the first step of many steps. But when I talk about sacrifice, I'm not talking about having to leave your job, or I'm just talking about like a little step toward being slightly more courageous. And I think that there has been, for lots of understandable reasons, a lot of them having to do with huge subjects that Jonathan Haidt, I'm sure, talked about, like social media and the internet and forced conformity and all of these things. It's very, very hard to do that right now. It is. It's very hard. I don't want to lie about that. But I will say that in my own life, stepping toward freedom has been the best decision I have ever made in my entire life, by far. And I shared this last night with some people at dinner, but I always go back to this. I always go back to this. I've been fascinated for a long time about what makes people courageous in hard circumstances. And I'm really drawn to stories about personal courage.
You had that podcast where you were focusing on Solzhenitsyn's very famous writing with that person from a rock band who got booted or something. I went with,
oh my God, I'm like, listen to this more than my mom. I'm so tired. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, his name's Winston Marshall. He's worth looking up, and the essay is called Live Not by Lies. Everyone should commit it to memory. But I want to mention another Soviet dissident, which is Natan Sharansky, who spent 13 years, of course, in the Gulag for the crime of wanting to make Aliyah to Israel. And I was with him a few years ago before COVID in Jerusalem, right before COVID, and I asked him, how do we teach young American Jews courage? We have an epidemic of conformity. How do we teach courage? And I was like, there's no better person in the world to ask that question that's alive. And he said, you can't teach courage. You can only show people how good it feels to be free. And I think that is very profound for anyone in any situation who is feeling like they are erasing part of themselves to get along. And the other thing I would say is just to connect back to sort of where we began, which is not to sound cheesy about it, guys, but like this is our, I mean, hopefully there's more. This is our only life. This is it. This is the grand show. And is the point of our life in the end of the day to get to just go along with the slipstream and get invited to the right party? I just don't think that's the point of life. Maybe for some people it is. It's not for me. I don't think that that is the Jewish way of being in the world. I really, really don't. If it was, we just wouldn't be here, and Jewish history wouldn't be the story that it is.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Even though that's a great screen-written place to end, one or two more questions from folks here.
I'll do them real fast so you can get to as many as you want.
All right. So considering how siloed we are politically, what's the best way to reach over to the other side?
Oh, wow, great question. First of all, doing it in your personal lives. Ask yourself, are you around people that think the same way about you about every topic that matters? Are you ever made uncomfortable at a Shabbat dinner? If you're not, you're not doing it right, guys. I don't know, like that's just not a way to live, and it's not a way to sharpen your own iron. Did I use that metaphor correctly?
Yes,
I'm very bad at that.
You're really into swords and arrows for some reason.
The Northmen.
Exactly,
it's
that's
the
it.
Northmen. It's infected my mind.
That's it.
Vikings. Okay, so I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is reading a lot and reading across. You know, don't just go to your political heroine. And for some people in this room, I assume it's Fox. For other people, I assume it's MSNBC. Try and unplug from cable news. Oh, thank you. I paid her to do that. So I'll Venmo you after. So anyway, that personal life, reading beyond what makes you comfortable, and searching out for, it's hard right now because everything is so diffuse, but really looking for independent voices. Okay, now I'm going to keep going. Give me more.
Okay, give you more. All right. Please comment on Elon Musk buying Twitter.
Yes, love it.
Really?
Beyond love it.
Really?
I'm going to tell you why. In an ideal world, would billionaires run everything in this country? No. But I can't make the perfect the enemy of the good right now. And to have a billionaire stand up and say, free speech matters, Twitter is the public square, and I am going to restore basic values that are enshrined in the Constitution and the First Amendment onto this platform, it was like manna from heaven. The only better day in recent years was when Jeremy Corbyn lost. I love it.
Listen, are people really holding back on Twitter? I mean, I feel like there's more on Twitter than human being, I ever want to know about any other human being.
Well, there's a total double standard. You can be, an Ayatollah in Iran or Louis Farrakhan and be on social media, but you can't make a joke as Babylon Bee and be on Twitter. What? That's crazy. That's clown world. I don't want to live in that world. I think Elon buying Twitter is awesome. Do I think ultimately that these social media platforms will come to be seen as something like common carriers or public utilities? Maybe. And do I think that it's a terrible thing that billionaires can basically run the show? I do. But Elon's way better than what we have now.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe he had some intel. I follow David Sachs on Twitter. He's really an interesting, he's part of the PayPal mafia, really interesting venture capitalist. And he's also written for my newsletter.
Are there any guardrails, though? I mean,
of course.
Misinformation.
What are you talking about? You can't yell. You can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater.
Yes.
You can't cause speech that can stoke physical violence is not allowed.
Good.
Of course there are guardrails.
Good.
What I object to is the notion that, and I think we're getting there quickly, that expressing support for the state of Israel is hate speech.
Yes.
That's what I reject.
Absolutely. What advice would you give to Jewish kids heading off to college to prepare them for the best possible situation for what they will encounter? At dinner, you're already saying you would never let your God willing child,
future children go to
future children
Columbia.
go to where you went to school.
Hell no, absolutely not. Well, I would say a few things. Is it really worth $80,000? Which is ask yourself, why is it worth that? It's craziness. Now, maybe in some cases it is, but in a lot of cases, I don't think that it is. And a lot of Jewish kids, by the way, a lot of just smart, curious kids might be better served by going and, getting an apprenticeship with someone, going and starting a business, going to school in Israel, going to the schools that have proven themselves, although some of them are shaky, to stand for free speech, like places like the University of Chicago. Or maybe anyone young in this room, come to this first year's summer school for the University of Austin that I'm involved with. Some of our teachers include people like Ayan Hersi, Neil Ferguson. I'll be there. Who knows, maybe Elon Musk or David Sachs will show up. I mean, I know nothing about building schools, but I'm on the board of this new university because when I looked out into the world, I was like, how are these our options? It's not a marketplace of ideas. It's a marketplace of one worldview, one idea. It's a place where kids feel the need to self-censor so they could get a good job at McKinsey or JP Morgan. I call bullshit on that. That's not what universities are supposed to be.
Is this part of the FIRE, the Jonathan Haidt's FIRE organization that kind of evaluates these schools?
So Jonathan Haidt's is Heterodox Academy. They're fighting for viewpoint diversity and civil disagreement. They actually have a conference in June in Denver, open to the public. I highly recommend it to everyone here. Heterodox Academy is the name. Then there's another wonderful organization that I support and love called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And they fight against, basically self-censorship on college campuses, from the right and the left, by the way. And they kind of do the work that the ACLU used to and has since given up.
Interesting. Have you seen a shift at the New York Times since you resigned?
No. No. It's so funny. They appointed a new executive. And by the way, there's still people there that I adore, and I read they have incredible China coverage, and a lot of good there, obviously. But they appointed a new executive editor, and I used to be like a Times Kremlinologist. I knew everything. And someone emailed me and was like, what do you think? And I thought, I don't think anything, because I don't really think about it anymore. Because what I'm trying to do is pick up the flag they put down and build a media company that right now is just a newsletter and a podcast, but I hope soon will be much bigger, that actually deserves your trust and allows you to reclaim a lot of the time that you currently spend digging through the internet to find out what's true and what isn't. And for me, the best sort of like shift in posture was from going to thinking about how to tweak the New York Times and try and shift it in the right direction to building something totally new.
Wonderful. Last comment. I mean, like any good prophet who starts with doom and gloom, they always leave us with
doom?
with uplift. We're just
Do you guys feel doom? No.
Okay, good. Well, you know what I'm saying. It's that there are so many. You've diagnosed, I think, very aptly, so many important things that we have to be concerned about and respond to. But like any good prophet, what's the wonderful message of hope that you have for us? Is this just a temporary trend and blip in our culture? Is this something, obviously you don't think we should wait it out, but what can we do? Leave us on a good Hollywood screen-written positive note.
Here it is.
Please.
Everything that you enjoy, every single luxury and privilege and blessing of your life happened because someone before you fought for it. That's it. Okay, so now you don't have to go fight a war. No one's asking you to do that or send your kid off to battle. We're asking you to be a little less popular and to maybe lose a few friends who weren't really your friends. Okay? That's it. In my case, it was, okay, someone said to me, you're so brave, you're so brave. I said, I'm sorry. I left a job at a newspaper. That's not that brave, guys. It's just not. And I think having a little bit of historical perspective will give people an incredible sense of what real bravery looks like. And hopefully inspire us to be a little braver in our moment. Nothing is written in stone. That is the lesson of Jewish history. It is the most unlikely story maybe of any people, any group, any story ever written. How did a little pisher group of people descended from slaves become us? How'd that happen? I'll tell you how it didn't happen. It didn't happen from people saying, not me. I'm going to wait for other people to do it. Likewise, for every single thing that's happened in American history, the expansion of what King called, right? When King talked about the promissory note in the founding documents, he didn't say, let's throw out the documents because they were written by slave owners, which they were. He said, my freedom is contained in that. And I'm going to draw on the promises of these documents to demand it. That is the story of America, of people demanding that the American dream come to encapsulate more and more and more people in a more expansive way. And so for me, it's weird because on the one hand, it's a radically progressive message. On the other hand, it's a conservative one. It's about digging back deeply into those core values that have given us the unbelievable situation that we are lucky enough to live in, and thinking about what it looks like to fight for them in a moment where they are under siege in a way that we could never have anticipated. I know maybe that's not the Hollywood ending or the Isaiah Jeremiah ending.
No, it is. It absolutely is the Isaiah promise for what it is to reconnect. Absolutely.
It was so wonderful to be here with all of you. And I know it's late, but a late happy Pesach, because it's my favorite holiday, because it is about truly the choice to be free. The last thing I'll say without getting too rabbinic is don't forget, not all the Jews left Egypt, guys. Not all the Jews left Egypt. Because, as Rashi says, they really liked the leeks.
And the cucumbers.
And the
exactly.
cucumbers. There's a deep message in that for us. Do we have the courage to be free? Do we have the courage to let go of whatever our equivalent leeks and cucumbers are? And to be like wandering people a little bit, lonely sometimes in the desert. That is the lesson, I think, for me of Passover this year, and the one that I would urge all of you to sort of carry out with you tonight. Thank you guys so much.
Very Weiss, everybody. Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you. Look at that standing O. All right. Two other quick comments. One is Bari's going to go out and sign some books, but give us a moment to get out there. Also, many, many, many thanks to Rabbi Kate Spicer, Jesse Cunningham, Jennifer Phillips, Julia Bentley, and so many people who helped to make this evening happen. And again, the Keller family for sponsoring this incredible opportunity to bring renowned speakers to our community. Give us a moment, please. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much.